Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. I can't remember the first time I met Dorothy Samuels, but I know that even though I'm older than she, I was young then and she was even younger, and she was just out of law school. Now she's a senior fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School after spending 30 years as a member of the editorial board of the New York Times. We have a lot to talk about, so
That's
welcome.
Sure, thank you for having me.
30 years at the New York Times.
Yeah.
You always think, the old gray lady.
Yeah, I'm now the old gray lady.
No, you're not. That's all right. No, you're not. Anyway, that had a special aura around it. Did you feel that?
Oh, absolutely, and think to this day, how lucky was I to land at the Times, and to land at the Times at the particular point I did, which was when print was still king, and sort of the old traditions were still there, and to be at the Times for this transition that society in general was making, where so much more opportunity for women, for minorities. I was there, when I first started, when you entered the elevator at the beautiful old Times building on 43rd Street to go to work, you looked around and there were a lot of men in dark suits and white shirts. And when I got to the editorial board, I think I had, at that point, I had 2 women colleagues. I think there had been 2 women on the board before me, before them, so not many in a lot of years of the paper. I think Max Frankel, who headed the board at that time, probably one of the great feminists might not have called himself that in that day. But
I went to high school and college with him.
Well, that would figure, the 2 great people.
I always planned to marry him because he was going to be a foreign correspondent, and that's secretly what I guess I wanted to be, but go on.
One of the things I loved, but was on some days at the editorial board meetings, which were 3 days a week and continued to be 3 days a week, one of the things that hasn't changed, that I would propose something and I thought, oh, well, this is non-controversial. And maybe our star economist who had come to us from Columbia University, who had also written 2 best-selling books, would say, well, why is that? And he would make you explain yourself, and then he'd question if that was right. I just learned so much. And also, it was, if I were going to describe part of the transition, it wasn't just in the population and going from a history of all these very talented, some crazy, to Gail Collins being the editor of the page. And I can't tell you what an amazing day that was, literally, when Gail arrived. And not because...
Was it different because she was a woman?
It was partly different because it was a woman. It was partly different just because it's Gail. And Gail is, in addition to being an extraordinary columnist who is always fun and interesting to read, and has this extraordinary knowledge of American politics, and really she learned a lot about the world politics. She is an extraordinary leader. Yeah. And the thing about Gail is she took over, as Hal Raines, the editor who preceded her, did downstairs, literally, not much more than 24 hours before the towers went down. Yeah. And there she is leading the page and in a whole new world of what you say. And I've always thought one of the proudest things about Gail's leadership in those early days was, from the beginning, she recognized that you could check the record, that apart from obviously the fright we all feel and the loyalty to our country at that moment, and the sadness for the losses, which were tremendous and sudden, she pointed out from the very beginning that in other times of stress in our country, this country has not always behaved well in terms of civil liberties and treating particular groups who were targeted, like the Japanese, for internment during World War II. And she said, this is something we should fight against. And she also said something very smart that seems even smarter to me in retrospect, which was, Gail's a very practical person. And she said, there are now going to be all these proposals trotted out that folks at the Republicans, Ashcroft, who is then Attorney General, have had on tap for years, ready to go, and now they have an excuse to get them. And she said, let's not race to do that, because when you look back on what happened on 9/11, they were mainly practical failures. That is, if you have a watch list that not only is over-inclusive, but people don't check. When people check in under their own names at the Boston airport, that's a practical management problem. That's not, we need to
Right.
curtail civil liberties for all time. So that was a very proud part of her record.
When there's an editorial,
Right.
and after your meeting, somebody then has the responsibility of writing that you propose it.
You get assigned.
Yeah. Do you have a vote on whether that's the position
Well,
the paper
sometimes
wants
the
to have?
editors would take a vote to get a sense of what, after a particularly important an issue that maybe we had had several meetings on, and you know, to get a sense of what the board felt. The decision is always the editor, some combination of the editor of the page, and then in consultation with the publisher, because in reality, the editorial board members really work for the publisher, because this is the opinion of the Times, and
Yeah.
therefore the Sulzberger family.
Yeah. So was that difficult?
I never,
You didn't have the problem?
well, I was never forced to write anything I
Yeah.
didn't believe.
What did you like to write about most?
Well, some of the things I liked to write about were not things I didn't like because they were hard issue, but I was very, you know, most of the issues as an editorial board member that you write about things that would appear in the paper, probably on the same day, in nearly the same language, with the same position, because the Times has been writing editorials for years. They have a lot of positions, and issues tend to be repetitive. And then and they mostly are reactions to things in the news. Then the special issues, I think probably to most editorial board members, are the issues where you take an issue that you think is not getting enough attention, may not be getting all the news coverage. Maybe it's an important bill in Congress no one's paying attention to. And you get the time and you get the assignment to write about that, and you pioneer it. And I'm sure at some point, you know,
Yeah.
it might have appeared in the paper, but you
Is that
passed
the-
it forward. And
Is that the most exciting kind of
well,
thing?
for me, the most exciting was the first editorial of a major paper endorsing same-sex marriage.
Ah,
And some of the very early years ago, pieces on transgender rights, advocating for trans. Now,
Right.
to be able to do that as an editorial board member, you need to have an editor who's
willing to do it. Right?
willing to do it, and if they haven't thought of it, willing to think of it.
Yeah.
And I mean, think of the editors. I mean, it was Max Frankel and Jack Rosenthal, who I think is just a giant, and just has a civic-minded purposefulness about him that is and then Gail, and you know, Andy Rosenthal was my final editor, who's actually leaving at the end of the week to write a column, and the fellow who's been running the Atlantic, who's a former Timesman, is coming back to run the opinion pages, which is, you know, the transition. Although I sort of hung around and was lucky to work under so many editors, it's also good to get new blood. The other thing I wanted to say, though, about the period that I was at the Times, when I first started, you would be having a discussion, say on a Tuesday, an editorial board meeting on a Tuesday, and some big foreign policy issue would come up, and someone inevitably at the table would say, "That's a great issue for Max for Sunday." For Sunday. Well, because in those days we didn't have the internet.
Yeah. the
Everybody
circulation.
wasn't racing in 1 second
Yeah.
to get the piece up. You could not, I mean, it seems like almost
A different world.
it's a
isn't it?
different world.
Totally.
You know, and then the question was Max's, and for Sunday, because Sunday I think may still be the largest circulation for the Times, but now it's internet, and I think internet subscriptions.
And it's 24 hours. It's just
and you have to, and if you
immediate response, right?
You know, and you could argue that some of the, and I think probably Dean Baquet, our current editor of the news section, which, just for understanding, is very separate from the editorial page. In my association with, you know, in my contacts with people from the news division, you know, I don't think I ever asked, well, what do you think? Because if I did, it would sort of break that great tradition of a separateness, and I think
It's like church and state.
Yes, exactly, and while in some ways that church-state line is collapsed, it is just true that that for the most part, at least on the editorial page, we editorialize and try not to in trying not to engage too much our colleagues downstairs.
So do you have a mission in life?
Well, I left the Times with a mission to continue what I was doing basically before I lucked out and got there, which is to continue to write about the issues I care about, to learn more. At the Brennan Center, I get to hang out with this remarkable group of largely younger, but not entirely, very accomplished people, mostly lawyers, involved in issues like voting rights, mostly issues I've written about, which was my association, issues and some issues that just hardly get any attention that I wrote about a lot, and always relying on the Brennan Center for their excellent research, which is this issue of judicial appointments, not only at the federal level, but also, arguably more importantly, at the local level, where our state court system is a wreck. And the system in most states, nearly all states, of electing judges has become very corrupted by big money, which is one of the phenomenons I witnessed over, if you say what are the changes over the course, I wrote an editorial in 1989 to coincide with the inauguration of George W. Bush. And it was complaining about what we called sewer money or soft money, the money from companies and whatever that got through the loophole where you could give, instead of giving directly to the official who had limits as a result of the presidential campaign financing system, you would give money through the party that benefited. And then that is now, and we were complaining about, I think, 50 million. And I think I saw a story the other day that I think a PAC for the Hillary was already at 150 million.
Right. The money is gone.
And some of that's Supreme Court, some of that is just how we got used to something. But one other thing I just overall wanted to say is that you saw so many things get better. The rights of gay people to marry, I mean, that was like an amazing thing in such a short period, and after not so long of the Times opining about it, and we had ups and downs, because as soon as you start opining about the Hawaii case, which was the litigation, you're then defeated in terms of your advocacy against the Defense of Marriage Act.
I was at City Hall in 1969, 1970, when the gays first, that became a prominent issue for an executive order from the mayor. I mean, I was there when they planned the first march, the Gay Rights March. It's just fabulous.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's go back to you and the world.
Yes.
Let's leave the Times for a minute. When we first met, you were very active in politics.
Yes.
That was a very important thing for you, wasn't it?
Yes, it was a period, as you know. I mean, I feel sort of guilty even saying this, because so many people died in the Vietnam War and in the protests to the war, when you think of the Kent State shootings and stuff. But for a young person interested in changing the world and for the better,
that's the
motivation. It was a very exciting, and young people were. It was a really exciting time, and then, a few years of doing that. Young people got the vote. Yeah, it was very exciting, though also, in a way, very sad. A lot of my best friends and best mentors, Ronnie Eldridge, I met during that period. But we all had a tremendous sense. And I think not just the young people. When you were young people involved, even if it was like me, running a Gestetner and writing literature for an anti-war congressional campaign in a basement somewhere in non-gentrified Brooklyn, you felt you were changing the world and making it a better
Does your heart
place.
warm a little bit when you see Black Lives Matter, when you see young people at the Bernie Sanders campaigns?
Well, it stirs in the sense that old feeling comes back, but I really never lost that old feeling.
Right. But other people didn't have it.
But one of the things about my politics and my husband's, that I think separated me from a lot of people of my generation politically was it really resonates with something President Obama said, I think this week, and I think he's speaking to folks from Black Lives Matter or whatever, but once you get the attention of people with your
Use it.
protest, use it. And there's a story that President Obama tells about having representatives of Black Lives Matter in the Oval Office, and everybody there is sort of yelling at, no one listens to what we say, and we're tired of being voiceless. And Obama says to him, wait, look around. You're in the Oval Office talking to the president. You've gotten my attention. What do we do? And you may have to compromise. I'm someone who supported Muskie.
Did you?
It turned out, yes. Peter and I went on our own to New Hampshire to try and organize the McCarthy people because we wanted to beat Nixon, because we were very concerned about
So
Nixon.
you're a
becoming
pragmatic
president.
politician.
I have a certain pragmatism. On the other hand, I was someone who, from the very beginning, was so captivated by Obama because I thought he had both things. He had the inspiration. He had none of the experience. Right. But I thought...
But I didn't think it hindered him, his lack of experience.
Well, but where did this guy come from? He was extraordinary. This guy from nowhere. Do you remember his first trip during the campaign overseas?
Right.
Where every candidate, even if they're experienced, trips up. Flawless. And also he was a guy, as he went overseas, who everyone wanted to meet, all the leaders of the world. And there was something about him. And this is from someone who spent the better part of the last 7 years writing things about aspects of his policy we didn't like, including on the inability of torture victims under George W. Bush to get a day in court, which is something that is still deeply troubling. And partly a mystery, how does this guy who comes to office with an agenda and a deep belief that we should not have gone off course either in this mistaken war based on shaky evidence that turned out to be wholly dishonest, but also in the abuse of the prisoners that has hurt this country so much and also ruined scores and scores of lives, and that broke treaties outright that the United States is obligated to abide by, and to this day damages the ability of the United States to be a strong leader for human rights and have the same influence. How did Obama reverse himself from the position on allowing the victims to have a day in court? Who is this guy? That's still a mystery to me.
Yeah.
He had a nothing record. That this was a guy who, if there was a controversial issue in the state Senate, he voted present. And there was nothing really in his record except this great writing.
No, Studs Terkel told us that there's this exceptional guy in the state Senate. The only problem is he needs to be pushed.
Well, yeah, he was not.
Yeah.
He was a guy who
So
Larry Tribe at Harvard Law School would say was probably not only the most brilliant, but the most mature individual in judgment he had ever had a student at Harvard Law School. And in fact, Larry was the first endorser in Iowa because he had nothing else. But he was also a guy who goes to one of the country's leading law schools, University of Chicago, to teach law and doesn't take a tenure track.
Yeah.
Because I don't think he had the gumption to work like that.
Yeah. I think of a word for him as elegant. I don't know why, but I think he is. He's elegant.
Yeah, he's elegant in his, not only in his manner, but he's elegant in his writing.
Yeah.
This is a president who I believe, as time goes by, will be compared to Lincoln in terms of his own writing as president.
I agree with you. I think it's very special.
And has continued to put the time in.
But do you think that part of the country has not reacted well because of race?
Oh, it's so sad. It's, I waited. It's such a sad thing to say and so profound a thing to say about our country that I waited a long time to even let that thought. And you have to remember that Bill Clinton, even at the beginning of his presidency, before his various escapades became known, Bill Clinton was never treated by the Republicans as a legitimate president. And so a lot of the treatment of Obama continued that.
I see.
He was not legitimate, and he's never been treated as a legitimate president, and that's been a lot of how the Republican dissing, but I have become convinced, like you, that a lot of it, unfortunately, does have to do. It was harder for him because of race, and it was also harder in ways that I think I still completely don't understand. harder for him to know how much of his identity to reveal, his, of his thinking. So I think there was something reserved about him that he did purposely so he could appeal to everybody. But yes, I think this guy, I just feel like even with the disagreements, both on style, and I'm sure we have some similar ones about a lack of aggression in the first term when we controlled Congress to move things as quickly. But boy, he has a lot of accomplishments.
Yes.
And he had a lot of obstacles. And when I hear the guy speak and the values he enunciates, even if I feel too often in areas I wrote about he didn't pursue those values or quickly enough, remarkable man. I feel so lucky that he came along when he did after really the awfulness for our country, I believe, of George W. Bush, a very, I always thought, likable man who I think helped ruin the country in many ways.
Was he strong or was he weak? Was he dominated by advisors?
I wasn't on the inside, so it's
I've
hard.
always wondered that question because he seems to be so he's just a friendly guy.
Well, I got to tell you, I'm going to talk a little out of school. I remember, you're not supposed to talk about these things.
That's all right, come on.
You weren't supposed to talk about editorials you wrote or areas when I first got there. That's changed some. But I used to tell friends, I wrote the ones you agree with to cover it. But I remember a meeting at the Times when he was running for president and meeting him in person and just, I was like the Zelig at some of these meetings, just sort of the anonymous person who got to sit in and listen and ask questions occasionally. And he was very genial, and you could be fooled into thinking, oh, he must agree with me. It's how he got elected. He's not going to be bad. He may be against abortion, but he's not going to try and dismantle abortion rights in America for women. He's not going to be so harsh. And a lot of the election turned, if you remember, on Oprah liked him, gave him a hug. He can't be bad. Oprah hugged him. But I remember at the end of the meeting, someone asked a question about the Supreme Court, and there was a steeliness to the answer because he didn't want you. He might have wanted you to understand he's really a human guy and he's not a bad guy, but who's your model Supreme Court justice? It was Scalia. And it was Scalia, and then you thought, well, maybe he likes his style, he thinks he's funny. And then you probe a little deeper, and no, he absolutely was well informed on the issues of the time, and he actually liked it and believed the malarkey about originalism.
I want to know about your confidence. Did you ever feel, look at me, I'm a member of the editorial board?
No, it was well, I felt proud to be there.
Yeah.
I felt in a certain way there was a logic to my being there because of all the different things I'd done. Being head of the Civil Liberties Union, I'd done a tremendous amount of writing. I had a column for The Nation, or I co-wrote a column on the selection of U.S. attorneys for a period. So there was a lot, working really hard sometimes after being at law, throwing things over the transom and being involved in intelligence issues, and heading the Civil Liberties Union, sort of being in the real world of fundraising and all of that. So on certain things I felt, well, I understood a lot of the discussion. I was in that world. But I looked around and just said, oh my God, these people are so smart and so well read. And so I was always learning and always amazed by the colleagues and always amazed till the day I left.
We come from a different generation. So I would think to myself, look at me. Ronnie Myers, that was my maiden name. Look at me, sitting here with all these people. It's a whole different generational thing that we...
Well, but from a young age, because of my involvement in campaigns and lucking out in who were involved in my issues on Long Island, and then I got involved in the founding of the reform group, the New Democratic Coalition. Everyone wanted a youth rep, and I did a lot. My husband and I were very close to Michael Harrington.
Oh, yeah.
Who then was a Democratic leader. In addition
Socialist.
Well, he was the leading socialist in the country.
Look at Bernie Sanders now.
Yeah. and just a good man. I worked with Dolores Huerta on the Great Boycott because the center of their effort was on Long Island. So I got to know you. Think of that. I was 25 years old and got to talk to one of the leading women political forces.
Talking about
in America. Me? Yeah. I got to know Bella. I got to know, so when I got to the Times, honestly, on one hand, how lucky was I? Because frankly, it's a job, Jack Rosenthal, a guy who really reached out to get me there when they were looking for women after the loss. So they needed more women at the Times, and I always thought I was a beneficiary of the fight those women put up for that. But he said to me, Dorothy, when you think about what we do here, what do? We sit around a table, like your kitchen table, and we do what every American does who cares about their country. We talk about the issues of the day, and then we send you back to your room to write something. But the fact is, our editing is so good here. You could write anything, and we could turn it into an editorial. So I always felt just lucky to be there, but not that it was strange. It was my dream to spend a life muckraking and being part of the issues and trying to push them uphill to make the world a fairer place.
And you think that that's what you have a future now that you're going to do it, but in a slightly different way?
Yes, one of my goals is to be, if anything, more deeply involved and more deeply knowledgeable about the things I care about. And like in the old days, not only write about it when I can, though unfortunately I don't have the platform of the Times to do it. You find one advantage of today, you find other places, and then people tweet, and you can get fairly large audiences, but also to then take the next step. So when you're asked to testify, you go and testify. And I'm around people who are doing these legal things and lawsuits, to be able to confer on them when people ask me things, to be able to be part of the advocacy as well. And so that's a treat. And it's also a treat to be able to spend more time that I really couldn't do to the degree I wanted to at the Times because of all the deadlines and whatever, to give it back.
The next time you come back, which is going to have to be soon, we're going to go and explore that.
Oh, that's great.
So
this
this
has been
time
such
has
fun.
just flown. So thank you
great.
so much, Dorothy Samuels.
Oh, thank you for having me. This has been such
You're
fun.
welcome. If there are any people you'd like to hear or topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016. Or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.